I'm Sarah Mitchell, and at 26, I thought moving back home during the pandemic was just temporary. But on Thanksgiving Day, as I struggled to breathe and collapsed onto the dining room floor, my father accused me of being dramatic and scolded me for breaking my stepmother's china. Hours later, doctors told me the truth. I was dying from massive blood clots in my lungs. That night, everything I believed about family, love, and survival shattered. Before I tell you what happened next, let me know where you're watching from, and thanks for being here. Growing up in the Mitchell household in Scottsdale, Arizona meant one thing above all else. Appearances were everything. My father, Robert Mitchell, owned Mitchell & Associates, one of the most successful accounting firms in the Phoenix metro area. Our house was a sprawling 7,000-square-foot contemporary masterpiece in the foothills, complete with infinity pool, 3-car garage, and views of Camelback Mountain that people paid millions for. But behind those perfectly manicured walls and Instagram-worthy holiday decorations lived a family that prioritized image over everything else, including their own daughter's well-being. Dad was the kind of man who commanded a room just by walking into it. 6'1", silver hair always perfectly styled, wearing $1,000 suits even on weekends. He built his accounting empire from nothing, starting in a cramped strip mall office when I was little, and expanding into the luxury high-rise downtown, where he now occupied the entire top floor. His success was everything to him, and by extension, our family's reputation was everything. My stepmother Linda came into our lives when I was 9, 3 years after my biological mother died in a car accident. Linda was a former local news anchor who gave up her career to marry into the Mitchell family fortune. At 44, she looked like she was still in her early 30s, thanks to a carefully maintained regimen of Botox, fillers, and whatever other procedures wealthy Scottsdale wives indulged in. She posted constantly on social media about our perfect family life, complete with professional photos and captions about being blessed. Then there was my younger half-brother Jake, now 18 and in his senior year at Scottsdale Prep. Jake was the golden child, star of the lacrosse team, straight A student, already accepted early admission to Stanford. Where I had always been seen as the problem child, Jake could do no wrong. He had Dad's charm and Linda's photogenic smile, and he played the part of perfect son flawlessly. The only person in my family who ever seemed to see me as an actual human being was my Uncle David, Dad's younger brother. David was 3 years younger than Dad, a former Marine who now worked as a general contractor. Where Dad lived for wealth and status, David lived simply in a modest ranch house about 20 minutes away. He'd never married, dedicating his life to his work and his vintage motorcycle collection. David was the only one who remembered my birthday without being reminded, who asked genuine questions about my life, who noticed when something was wrong. From as early as I can remember, any time I complained about feeling sick or being hurt, I was met with skepticism rather than sympathy. When I was 8 and came down with what I thought was just a stomach bug, I spent 3 days throwing up before Linda finally, reluctantly, took me to urgent care. The doctor said I was severely dehydrated and could have gone into shock if we'd waited much longer. Dad's response wasn't concern. It was irritation about the unexpected medical bill. When I was 12 and broke my collarbone falling off my bike, Dad made me sit through an entire client dinner before taking me to the hospital, convinced I was exaggerating for attention. The x-ray showed a clean break that the emergency room doctor said must have been extremely painful. Dad just shrugged and said kids needed to learn to be tough. The pattern continued throughout my childhood and teenage years. Migraines were dismissed as stress from not studying hard enough. Panic attacks were labeled dramatic episodes for attention. When I tore my ACL during sophomore year track practice, Dad made me finish the season on it because quitters don't succeed in this family. By the time we finally got an MRI, the damage was so severe I needed 2 surgeries and never ran competitively again. The message was crystal clear. My pain didn't matter, my experiences weren't valid, and expressing discomfort was a character flaw that needed to be corrected. Uncle David was the only one who ever questioned this treatment. I remember him pulling Dad aside after one particularly bad incident when I was 15. I'd been running a 103-degree fever for 2 days, and Dad refused to let me miss a family friend's wedding because it would look bad. David had quietly driven me to his house afterward and taken me to urgent care himself, where they diagnosed me with pneumonia and said I needed immediate antibiotics. She could have been hospitalized, Rob, I heard him telling Dad later that night. This isn't about being tough. This is about her health. Dad's response was predictable. David, you don't have kids. You don't understand that they'll manipulate you if you let them. By the time I graduated high school, I had learned to suffer in silence. I stopped mentioning when I felt unwell, stopped asking for help when I was injured, and started handling everything on my own. This seemed to confirm Dad and Linda's belief that my previous complaints had been nothing but attention-seeking behavior. College at Arizona State University was like being released from prison. For 4 years, I lived in a world where people took me at my word. When I told my roommate Chloe that I had a migraine, she brought me medicine and dimmed the lights without question. When I got the flu sophomore year, my friends brought me soup and checked on me regularly. For the first time in my life, I experienced what it felt like to have my experiences validated rather than dismissed. After graduation, I landed a marketing position with a boutique firm in downtown Phoenix. The pay wasn't spectacular, but it was enough to rent a small apartment in Tempe and build a life separate from my family. I visited for obligatory holidays and maintained polite distance from the people who had trained me not to trust my own body. Everything changed when the pandemic hit. My marketing firm lost half their clients in 2 months, and as one of the newest employees, I was among the first to be laid off. With rent in Phoenix skyrocketing and my savings dwindling faster than I'd anticipated, I faced a reality I'd spent years trying to avoid: moving back home. Dad's offer came with conditions, of course. I could live in the converted casita behind the pool, rent-free, but I was expected to contribute to household management and help with Linda's various social obligations. After 6 months of unsuccessful job hunting, I swallowed my pride and moved back to Scottsdale. The casita was nice enough. A 600-square-foot guest house with its own entrance, kitchenette, and bathroom. But being back in that environment, even with physical separation, brought back all the old patterns. Every time I mentioned feeling tired, Linda suggested I needed more exercise. When I had trouble sleeping, Dad attributed it to guilt about not contributing financially. Any sign of stress or discomfort was met with the same dismissive attitude that had defined my childhood. About a month before Thanksgiving, I started experiencing some concerning symptoms. It began with fatigue that seemed disproportionate to my activity level. I'd wake up after 8 hours of sleep feeling like I hadn't slept at all. Simple tasks like walking to the main house or carrying groceries left me unexpectedly winded. At first, I told myself it was stress from the job search. Being unemployed and living with family again was certainly taking a psychological toll. But as the weeks progressed, the symptoms intensified. I developed a persistent ache in my right calf that I attributed to sitting too much while job hunting online. Sharp pains in my chest would come and go, especially when I took deep breaths or laughed. The old voice in my head, the one that sounded remarkably like my father, kept minimizing what I was experiencing. "You're out of shape. You're stressed. You're being dramatic." Years of conditioning had trained me to doubt my own perceptions, to assume I was overreacting to normal discomfort. I called Chloe one evening, 3 weeks before Thanksgiving, after a particularly concerning day where I'd had to stop halfway up the stairs to the main house because I couldn't catch my breath. "You sound terrible," she said immediately. "Are you getting sick?" "I don't know," I admitted. "I've been really tired lately, and I keep getting these weird chest pains. Have you seen a doctor?" The question hung in the air. Have I seen a doctor? The idea felt simultaneously obvious and impossible. "It's probably nothing," I heard myself saying, the automatic response so ingrained I didn't even think about it. "Sarah," Chloe's voice was firm, "you know your body better than anyone else. If something feels wrong, it probably is wrong. Don't let your family's history make you ignore what you're feeling." Her words hit deeper than I expected. She was right. I was letting my family's past dismissals influence my current medical decisions. But the fear of being seen as dramatic, of confirming their belief that I was an attention seeker, felt overwhelming. "I'll see how I feel after Thanksgiving," I promised her, a compromise that felt manageable. I had no idea that Thanksgiving would change everything. The morning of Thanksgiving 2023, I woke up feeling worse than I had in weeks. My chest felt tight, like someone had wrapped a band around my ribs and was slowly tightening it. Getting dressed required multiple breaks as waves of dizziness washed over me. The shower left me so exhausted I had to sit on the bathroom floor for 10 minutes afterward. Looking in the mirror, I barely recognized myself. My skin was pale with a grayish undertone, and there were dark circles under my eyes that makeup couldn't quite cover. But today was Thanksgiving, and in the Mitchell family, Thanksgiving was a production. Linda had invited her parents, Dad's business partner and his wife, and Uncle David. 14 people total, all expecting the perfect Mitchell family experience they'd been seeing on Linda's social media for months. And somehow, despite being the unemployed daughter living in the guest house, I'd been assigned most of the hostess duties. "Sarah needs to pull her weight around here," I'd overheard Dad telling Linda the week before. "She's been freeloading long enough." So while Linda focused on getting herself camera ready and Jake was excused to spend the morning with his girlfriend, I was responsible for setting the table, coordinating with the caterers, and handling the various crises that always seemed to arise when Linda entertained. By 10 a.m., I was already struggling. The simple act of arranging 14 place settings had left me breathless and dizzy. When I bent down to adjust the tablecloth, a sharp pain shot through my chest so intense I gasped audibly. "Everything okay?" Uncle David had arrived early, as he always did, carrying his traditional contribution of homemade dinner rolls. "Fine," I said automatically, forcing a smile. "Just trying to get everything perfect." David studied my face with the attention of someone who actually cared about the answer. "You look pale, kiddo. You feeling all right?" The genuine concern in his voice almost broke my resolve. For a moment, I wanted to tell him everything, about the weeks of symptoms, the growing fear that something was seriously wrong, the way I'd been dismissing my own body's warnings. But Linda chose that moment to sweep into the dining room, resplendent in her designer dress and fresh blowout. "David, you're early. Sarah, did you remember to chill the wine? And we need more candles on the table. It looks sparse." She surveyed my work with the critical eye of someone whose entire identity was built on entertaining perfection. The moment passed, and I returned to my preparations, ignoring the way my heart seemed to be racing even while I stood still. By the time the first guests arrived at 2 p.m., I was moving through my tasks on autopilot, concentrating on each breath because breathing had somehow become something I had to think about consciously. Dad's business partner and his wife complimented the table setting and the floral arrangements, never suspecting that the hostess was fighting to stay upright. Dinner itself was a blur of serving dishes, refilling wine glasses, and making polite conversation while my chest felt like it was caught in a vice. I barely touched my own food, partly because I had no appetite, and partly because swallowing had become difficult. Uncle David kept shooting me concerned glances from across the table, but with Dad and Linda holding court with their guests, there was no opportunity for private conversation. After dinner, as the adults moved to the living room for coffee and dessert, Linda handed me a pointed look that needed no translation. Cleanup was my responsibility. I began clearing plates, moving slowly and deliberately, because quick movements seemed to make the chest pain worse. That's when disaster struck. As I reached for a serving platter, a wave of dizziness hit me so hard I had to grip the edge of the table. The stack of dinner plates I'd been carrying crashed to the floor, shattering Linda's precious bone china into hundreds of pieces. The sound brought Dad storming into the dining room, his face already dark with anger before he'd even assessed the situation. Behind him came Linda, gasping dramatically at the sight of her broken dishes. "What the hell, Sarah?" Dad's voice carried the particular tone he reserved for his greatest disappointments. "Those plates cost $400 each." I tried to explain, to tell him that I felt dizzy, that something was wrong, but the words came out in gasps. "Dad, I can't breathe right." "Oh, for Christ's sake," his eyes rolled with familiar exasperation. "Quit faking it, Sarah. This is exactly the kind of attention-seeking bullshit I've been dealing with your entire life." "I'm not faking," I managed, but my voice was barely a whisper. The room was starting to spin, and I had to lean against the wall to stay upright. That's when Dad lost it completely. He grabbed me by the shoulders, his fingers digging into my collarbone, hard enough to bruise. "Stop being so goddamn dramatic. You break my wife's dishes and then try to distract from it with another one of your episodes?" He shook me, hard, my head snapping back and forth. "You're embarrassing this family in front of our guests." Then he shoved me backward, hard. I stumbled, my legs giving out completely, and crashed to the floor among the broken china. The impact drove what little air I had from my lungs, and suddenly I couldn't breathe at all. The room went gray around the edges as I fought desperately for oxygen that wouldn't come. "Get up and clean this mess right now," Dad was standing over me, still shouting, still convinced this was all an act. That's when Uncle David appeared in the doorway. "Jesus Christ, Rob, what did you do?" Uncle David took one look at me on the floor, struggling to breathe, and his military training kicked in immediately. He dropped to his knees beside me, his fingers finding my pulse. "Her heart's racing like crazy," he said, his voice sharp with alarm. "And look at her lips. They're blue." "She's faking it, David," Dad insisted, but there was less conviction in his voice now. "She always has been." "Call 911, David ordered, not taking his eyes off me. "We are not calling an ambulance for another one of her dramatic episodes," Dad shot back. David pulled out his own phone. "Then I will." Linda rushed in, assessed the scene, and immediately sided with Dad. "Sarah, stop this nonsense right now. Our guest can hear everything," but David was already speaking to the emergency dispatcher, his voice calm and professional. "I need an ambulance at 15847 Desert Mountain Road in Scottsdale. I have a 26-year-old female in severe respiratory distress. Pulse is rapid and thready. Patient is cyanotic and semi-conscious." "David, hang up that phone right now," Dad demanded, moving toward him. "Her pulse is over 140, Rob," David said, without looking up from me. "Her oxygen saturation has to be critically low. Look at her." For the first time, Dad really looked. He saw my blue-tinged lips, the way I was fighting for each breath, the genuine terror in my eyes. His anger flickered, replaced by something that might have been uncertainty. "The dispatcher wants to know if she's been having any symptoms recently," David said, holding the phone against his ear while keeping one hand on my wrist. "She's been complaining about being tired," Linda said dismissively. "But she's been having chest pains and shortness of breath for weeks," David cut her off, surprising everyone. "I saw her struggling at dinner. This isn't dramatic, this is a medical emergency." Through my haze of oxygen deprivation, I heard the sirens getting closer. Uncle David kept talking to me, telling me help was coming, that I was going to be okay. His voice was the only calm thing in a room full of chaos. The paramedics arrived 8 minutes later, and their response confirmed what David already knew. The lead EMT took one look at me and immediately called for a stretcher. "Ma'am, can you tell me your name?" he asked. But I could barely whisper a response. "Blood pressure is 85/50, his partner called out. "Oxygen saturation is 78%. "We need to move now," the lead EMT said grimly. "Ma'am, we're going to take you to the hospital. You're having trouble getting enough oxygen." As they loaded me onto the stretcher, I caught a glimpse of Dad's face. For the first time in my life, I saw genuine fear in his eyes. And underneath that fear was something else, the dawning realization of what he'd done. The ride to Scottsdale Osborne Medical Center was a blur of oxygen masks, IV lines, and urgent medical conversations I couldn't quite follow. Uncle David rode with me, holding my hand and speaking in the steady, reassuring tone of someone who'd seen medical emergencies before. "Stay with me, kiddo," he kept saying. "You're going to be fine." At the hospital, I was rushed straight into the emergency department's trauma bay. Dr. Jennifer Walsh, the attending physician, took one look at my condition and immediately ordered a battery of tests. 26-year-old female, acute respiratory failure, suspected pulmonary embolism, she announced to her team. "Get me a CT angiogram of the chest stat. And I want an ultrasound of her legs." The words, pulmonary embolism, cut through my oxygen-deprived fog. Blood clots in the lungs. That was serious. That was potentially deadly. As they wheeled me toward the CT scanner, I lost consciousness. I woke up 2 days later in the ICU, connected to more machines than I could count. Uncle David was sitting in the chair beside my bed, looking like he hadn't slept since Thanksgiving. "Hey there, kiddo," he said softly when he saw my eyes open. "Welcome back." My throat was raw from the breathing tube they'd removed that morning, but I managed to croak out a question. "What happened?" David's expression was grim. "You had multiple blood clots in your lungs, Sarah. Big ones," the doctor said without immediate treatment. He didn't finish the sentence, but he didn't need to. "I almost died?" "Yeah," he said simply. "You almost died." Over the next hour, David filled in the gaps in my memory. The CT scan had revealed massive pulmonary emboli, multiple large blood clots blocking the major arteries in both lungs. I'd been rushed into emergency surgery for a procedure called catheter-directed thrombolysis, where they'd threaded catheters directly into my lungs to break up the largest clots. The doctor said you'd been having symptoms for weeks, David continued. Fatigue, shortness of breath, chest pain, leg pain. Classic signs that everyone missed. Everyone didn't miss them, I said quietly. Everyone dismissed them. David's jaw tightened. I should have said something sooner. I saw how they treated you growing up, and I should have intervened. Before I could respond, Dad appeared in the doorway. He looked terrible, hair disheveled, clothes wrinkled, eyes red with exhaustion and what might have been guilt. Sarah, he said hesitantly, how are you feeling? It was such a loaded question. How was I feeling? Physically, I was alive, which was more than could have been said 48 hours ago. Emotionally, I was a wreck of anger, relief, and vindication. Better, I said simply. Dad approached the bed carefully, like he was afraid I might disappear. The doctor, Dr. Walsh. She explained what happened, about the blood clots. I waited for him to continue, but he seemed to be struggling with words. She said, he started again, then stopped. She said you could have died, that without immediate treatment, you would have died. Yes, I said. I know. I didn't know it was serious, he said finally, the words coming out in a rush. I thought it was another dramatic episode, I finished for him. Another attention-seeking performance. He flinched. I was wrong. It wasn't quite an apology, but it was more acknowledgement than he'd ever given me before. Dad, I said quietly, do you remember what you did in the dining room? Before the paramedics came? His face went pale. Sarah, I was angry about the dishes. You grabbed me. You shook me. You pushed me to the floor while I was having a medical emergency. The words hung in the air between us. Uncle David's expression had gone very still, very dangerous. You did what? David's voice was quiet, but there was steel underneath it. Dad looked between us, realizing that David hadn't known about the physical altercation. I was angry, he said weakly. I didn't know she was actually sick. So that makes it okay? David stood up, and I could see the Marine in him now. You put your hands on her while she was struggling to breathe? David, please, Dad began, but David cut him off. No, Rob. Do you understand what could have happened? She was already in respiratory distress, and you physically assaulted her. The word assault made Dad recoil. Intent doesn't matter, David said flatly. Impact matters. And the impact was that you made a life-threatening situation worse. Over the next few days, as I recovered in the hospital, the full picture of what had happened began to emerge. Dr. Walsh explained that I'd developed what's called a deep vein thrombosis, a blood clot in my right leg, probably as a result of prolonged sitting during my job search, combined with genetic factors that made my blood more prone to clotting. Pieces of that clot had broken off and traveled through my bloodstream to my lungs, blocking the arteries that carried oxygen to my blood. The symptoms you described, the fatigue, shortness of breath, chest pain. These are textbook signs of pulmonary embolism, Dr. Walsh told my family during a meeting on my 4th day in the hospital. This should have been caught weeks ago with proper medical attention. Dad shifted uncomfortably in his chair. Linda, who had finally shown up to the hospital that morning after spending 2 days at a spa processing the trauma, looked like she'd rather be anywhere else. How are we supposed to know? Linda asked defensively. We're not doctors. Dr. Walsh's response was measured but pointed. When someone repeatedly tells you they can't breathe, the appropriate response is to believe them and seek medical attention, not to dismiss their concerns. That's when I finally found my voice. I told you, I said quietly, addressing the room but looking directly at Dad. For weeks I told you something was wrong. I told you I couldn't breathe right, that I was having chest pains, that something felt off. Dad looked away, unable to meet my eyes. And instead of believing me, you called me dramatic. You said I was attention-seeking. You accused me of faking it while I was literally dying. Sarah, Linda began in her most condescending tone. Nobody could have known. Stop, I interrupted. And the firmness in my own voice surprised me. Just stop. This isn't the first time my medical concerns have been dismissed in this family. It's been happening my entire life. I turned to Dr. Walsh. When I was 12, I broke my collarbone. My father made me sit through a client dinner before taking me to the hospital because he thought I was exaggerating. When I was 15, I had pneumonia. They refused to let me miss a social event because it would look bad, even though I had a 103-degree fever. Dr. Walsh's expression grew increasingly grave as I continued. I tore my ACL in high school. They made me finish the track season on it because quitters don't succeed. I've been taught my entire life to doubt my own body, to ignore my own pain, to assume I'm being dramatic when I'm actually hurt. Sarah, that's not fair, Dad said weakly. Isn't it? I looked at him directly for the first time since he'd entered my hospital room. You literally pushed me to the ground while I was having a pulmonary embolism. You cared more about Linda's broken dishes than your daughter's life. The room fell silent except for the steady beeping of my heart monitor. Uncle David spoke up. She's right, Rob. I've watched this pattern for years. Every time Sarah got hurt or sick, you dismissed it. Every time she needed medical attention, you delayed it. You trained her not to trust her own body. I was trying to teach her to be strong, Dad said. But his voice lacked conviction. You taught her that her pain didn't matter, David replied. You taught her that her experiences weren't valid, and it almost killed her. Dr. Walsh cleared her throat. Mr. Mitchell, your daughter will need ongoing medical care for the next several months. Blood thinners, regular monitoring, follow-up appointments. She needs a support system that takes her health seriously. Of course, Dad said quickly. Whatever she needs. I won't be needing support from this family, I said quietly. Uncle David has offered to let me stay with him during my recovery. Dad's face crumpled. Sarah, please. I know I made mistakes, but you're my daughter. Let me make this right. You don't get to make this right, I said. And for the first time in my life, I felt the power of speaking my truth without apology. You don't get to assault me during a medical emergency and then ask for forgiveness when you find out I was actually dying. Linda stood up abruptly. This is ridiculous. Sarah, you're being overly dramatic about. Get out, I said calmly. Excuse me? Get out of my hospital room, now. Dr. Walsh nodded to the security guard who had been standing by the door. Apparently, she'd anticipated this conversation might not go smoothly. Linda huffed and stormed out, muttering about ungrateful children. Dad lingered for a moment, looking like he wanted to say something more, but ultimately followed his wife out of the room. Uncle David stayed. You don't have to take care of me, I told him once we were alone. I'm not your responsibility. You're not my responsibility, he agreed. You're my family. There's a difference. 2 weeks later, I was discharged from the hospital with a prescription for blood thinners, a follow-up schedule that would dominate the next 6 months, and a new understanding of my own worth. Uncle David's house was small but comfortable, and for the first time in months, I felt safe. He didn't question when I needed to rest, didn't dismiss my concerns about medication side effects, and never once suggested that I was being dramatic when I worried about my health. The physical recovery was slow. Blood thinners meant constant vigilance for signs of bleeding, and my lung function took weeks to return to normal. But the emotional recovery was even more complex. I started therapy, real therapy, with a counselor who specialized in medical trauma and family dysfunction. Dr. Sandra Martinez helped me understand that what I'd experienced wasn't just medical dismissal, but a form of emotional abuse that had conditioned me to doubt my own perceptions. Your family trained you not to trust yourself, she explained during one of our sessions. They taught you that your experiences weren't valid, that your pain didn't matter. That kind of conditioning doesn't disappear overnight. She was right. Even with medical evidence of how seriously ill I'd been, part of me still wondered if I was somehow overreacting. Years of gaslighting don't disappear just because you nearly die. Dad made several attempts to reconcile. He sent flowers, left voicemails, even showed up at David's house once. But every conversation felt like an attempt to minimize what had happened, rather than genuinely acknowledge the harm he'd caused. I was scared, he said during one phone call. When I saw all those machines in the hospital, when the doctor said you could have died, I was terrified. I didn't know how to process that. You should have been scared when I told you I couldn't breathe, I replied. You should have been concerned when I said something was wrong. Your fear doesn't matter if it only comes after you find out I was telling the truth. Linda never apologized at all. In fact, she posted on social media about the family crisis that had brought everyone closer together, complete with a photo of flowers she'd supposedly sent to the hospital. The flowers never arrived. Jake, surprisingly, was the one family member who seemed to genuinely understand the gravity of what had happened. He came to visit me at David's house a month after I was discharged, looking uncomfortable but determined. "I need to apologize to you," he said without preamble. "For what?" "For knowing how they treated you and never saying anything. For being okay with it because it meant they weren't doing it to me." His honesty was unexpected and painful. "I always knew Dad was harder on you," he continued. "I just told myself it was because you were older, or because you were a girl, or because, I don't know, I made up reasons. But watching what happened at Thanksgiving, seeing how they reacted even when you were obviously really sick, I realized I've been complicit in something really messed up." "Jake, you were just a kid." "I'm 18 now," he interrupted. "I'm old enough to know right from wrong, and I should have said something years ago. 3 months after my hospitalization, I got a job with a marketing agency in Phoenix that specialized in healthcare communications. The irony wasn't lost on me, spending my days helping medical practices communicate more effectively with patients while recovering from my own medical trauma. The work was fulfilling in a way I hadn't expected. I found myself particularly passionate about projects related to patient advocacy and medical communication. My experience had given me insight into the patient perspective that many of my colleagues lacked. Dad made one final attempt at reconciliation 6 months after Thanksgiving. He showed up at my new apartment. I'd moved out of David's house once I was stable enough to live independently, with a letter he'd written. "I've been seeing a therapist," he said when I reluctantly let him in. "Someone who specializes in family communication and anger management." I waited for him to continue. "She helped me understand some things about how I was raised, about how I've been treating you, about the patterns I inherited from my own father." It was more self-reflection than I'd ever heard from him, but I remained guarded. "Sarah, I know I can't undo what happened. I know I can't take back the years of dismissing your pain or the way I treated you when you were dying. But I want you to know that I understand now how wrong I was." He handed me the letter. "Everything I want to say is in there. But the most important thing is this: you deserved better. You deserved a father who believed you, who protected you, who prioritized your well-being over his own comfort. And I failed you completely." The letter was 7 pages long and more honest than any conversation we'd ever had. In it, he detailed specific memories of dismissing my pain, acknowledged the pattern of emotional invalidation, and took full responsibility for creating an environment where I learned to doubt myself. He also revealed something I hadn't known. My biological mother had been chronically ill in the years before her death, suffering from an autoimmune condition that caused unpredictable symptoms. Dad had spent those years frustrated by her constant complaints about pain and fatigue, dismissing her concerns just as he later dismissed mine. "I was angry at her for being sick," he wrote. "I was angry at the uncertainty, the doctor visits, the way her illness disrupted our plans. When she died in that car accident, I convinced myself that at least I wouldn't have to deal with constant medical drama anymore. When you started having health issues, it brought back all that anger and frustration. I projected my feelings about your mother's illness onto you, and that was unforgivable." The revelation recontextualized my entire childhood. I hadn't just been dismissed for being dramatic. I'd been dismissed because my father was working through his own unresolved trauma about my mother's illness. It didn't excuse his behavior, but it explained it. I called him 2 weeks after reading the letter. "Thank you for writing that," I said. "For being honest about Mom, about your own issues, about everything. Does it change anything between us?" he asked hopefully. "It changes my understanding of why things happened the way they did," I said carefully. "But Dad, you didn't just dismiss my medical concerns. You physically assaulted me while I was having a medical emergency. That's not something therapy can just fix." "I know," he said quietly. "I know I lost the right to be your father that day." "You lost the right to be my father long before that day," I corrected him. That was just the culmination of years of emotional abuse. We talked for over an hour, the longest honest conversation we'd ever had. By the end, we'd established some boundaries. He could call me once a month to check in. He would continue therapy, and he would never again minimize or dismiss anyone's medical concerns. It wasn't reconciliation exactly, but it was acknowledgement. And sometimes, acknowledgement is enough. A year after my near-death experience, I was invited to speak at a patient advocacy conference about medical gaslighting in families. Standing in front of 200 healthcare professionals, I told my story about the continued years of dismissed symptoms, about nearly dying while being called dramatic, about the importance of believing patients even when their families don't. Medical gaslighting doesn't just happen in doctors' offices, I told the audience. It happens in families, in relationships, in any dynamic where one person's pain is consistently minimized or dismissed. As healthcare providers, you have the power to break those cycles by validating your patients' experiences, even when their support systems don't. After my presentation, a young resident approached me. "Thank you for sharing your story," she said. "I had a patient last week whose family kept insisting she was being dramatic about her chest pain. Your talk reminded me to trust the patient, not the family dynamics." 3 weeks later, that resident called to tell me the patient had been diagnosed with a heart condition that could have been fatal if ignored. "Your story literally saved someone's life," she said. That's when I knew I'd found my purpose. I started a blog called Trust Your Body, where I shared stories from people who'd experienced medical dismissal, from families, partners, and healthcare providers. The response was overwhelming. Hundreds of people wrote to share their own experiences of being told they were dramatic, attention-seeking, or imagining their symptoms. One woman wrote about having endometriosis dismissed as normal period pain for 15 years. A man shared his story of having his heart attack symptoms attributed to anxiety by his wife and children. A teenager described being forced to participate in sports despite severe knee pain that turned out to be a serious joint condition. Each story reinforced the same truth. When we teach people not to trust their own bodies, we put their lives at risk. The blog grew into a nonprofit organization focused on patient advocacy and medical education. We developed training programs for healthcare providers about recognizing and addressing medical gaslighting. We created resources for patients on how to advocate for themselves when their concerns are dismissed. We partnered with medical schools to integrate patient advocacy training into their curricula. Uncle David became my biggest supporter, helping with everything from website design to event planning. "I'm proud of you, kiddo," he told me after our first major fundraising event. "You took something terrible that happened to you and turned it into something that helps other people." Jake finished his freshman year at Stanford and came home for the summer a different person. College had given him perspective on our family dynamics that he'd never had before. "I've been thinking a lot about that Thanksgiving," he told me over coffee. "About how differently Dad and Linda treated you compared to how they treated me. I want to do better." He'd actually changed his major from business to pre-med, inspired partly by what had happened to me. "I want to be the kind of doctor who believes their patients," he said, "who doesn't dismiss women's pain or assumes someone is being dramatic." Linda and I never reconciled. She continued to post about our perfect family on social media, conveniently editing out the daughter who'd nearly died on her dining room floor. When people asked about me, she told them I was going through a rebellious phase and would come around eventually. I was okay with that. Some relationships are too toxic to salvage, and I'd learned that protecting my peace was more important than maintaining family harmony. Dad and I settled into a distant but civil relationship. He kept his promise about monthly phone calls, during which he'd ask about my health, my work, and my life, without offering unsolicited advice or criticism. He'd also started volunteering with a patient advocacy group in Scottsdale, something his therapist had suggested as a way to make amends. "I can't undo the harm I caused you," he said during one of our calls. "But maybe I can prevent other families from making the same mistakes." It wasn't enough to heal our relationship completely, but it was something. 2 years after my pulmonary embolism, I met someone. Dr. Marcus Chen was an emergency medicine physician who'd attended one of my patient advocacy workshops. He'd been drawn to the work because of his own experiences as an Asian American doctor who'd seen too many patients dismissed because of racial or gender bias. What I loved about Marcus was that he never once questioned my health concerns or suggested I was being dramatic. When I mentioned feeling tired, he asked follow-up questions. When I worried about medication side effects, he took my concerns seriously. He treated my body and my experiences with the respect I'd spent years learning to demand. You know what's beautiful about you, he told me one evening as we walked through the botanical gardens in Phoenix. You know exactly what you need, and you're not afraid to ask for it. So many people have been conditioned to minimize their own needs, but you've learned to trust yourself completely. He was right. The experience of nearly dying because I'd been taught not to trust my own body had taught me the most valuable lesson of my life. I am the expert on my own experience. My pain is real. My concerns are valid, and I will never again let anyone convince me otherwise. On the 3rd anniversary of that terrible Thanksgiving, I published a book about medical advocacy called Trust Your Body, a guide to self-advocacy in healthcare. The dedication read, "To Uncle David, who believed me when no one else would, and to everyone who has ever been told they're being dramatic, you're not. Trust yourself." The book became a bestseller, not because my writing was particularly brilliant, but because the message resonated with so many people who'd experienced similar dismissal. I received thousands of emails from readers sharing their own stories, thanking me for validating their experiences, telling me how the book had helped them advocate for themselves or their loved ones. One email particularly stood out. It was from a mother whose teenage daughter had been experiencing chronic fatigue and pain. Multiple doctors had suggested it was psychological, and the family had begun to doubt the girl's symptoms. "I read your book and realized we were doing to our daughter exactly what your family did to you," she wrote. "We kept looking for psychological explanations instead of believing her when she said something was physically wrong. Because of your story, we kept pushing for answers. Turns out she has a rare autoimmune condition that requires treatment. If we'd continued dismissing her symptoms, she could have suffered permanent damage. You saved my daughter's health, maybe her life." Stories like that made everything worthwhile. The years of pain, the near-death experience, the difficult process of rebuilding my relationship with my own body and my family. If my suffering could prevent someone else's, then it had meaning. Today, I'm 29 years old and healthier than I've been in years. I take my blood thinners religiously, attend all my follow-up appointments, and pay attention to my body's signals without dismissing them. I've learned to see my medical vigilance not as paranoia or drama, but as self-care and wisdom. I still live in Phoenix, in a small house near Uncle David's. I still run the nonprofit, which now has a staff of 12 and has trained over 5,000 healthcare providers in patient advocacy. I still write and speak about medical gaslighting because the problem is far from solved. Marcus and I got engaged last month, and we're planning a wedding for next fall. It will be small. Uncle David, Jake, a few close friends, and the family I've chosen rather than the one I was born into. Dad asked if he could attend, and after much consideration, I told him he could come as a guest, but he wouldn't be walking me down the aisle. That honor belongs to Uncle David, the man who believed me when it mattered most. Sometimes people ask me if I've forgiven my father for what happened that Thanksgiving. It's a complicated question. I've forgiven him in the sense that I don't carry anger about it every day. I understand that his behavior came from his own trauma and conditioning. I can see him as a flawed human being, rather than a monster. But forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting. It doesn't mean pretending the abuse didn't happen or that the consequences weren't real. It doesn't mean welcoming him back into my life as if nothing changed. What happened that Thanksgiving taught me that love without respect is meaningless, care without belief is empty, and family ties don't excuse abuse, no matter how unintentional. I've built a new life based on different principles: trust, respect, validation, and the radical idea that I am the expert on my own experience. It's a life where my pain matters, my concerns are taken seriously, and my voice is heard. If you're watching this and you recognize yourself in my story, if you've been told you're being dramatic, if your pain has been dismissed, if you've learned not to trust your own body, I want you to know something. You're not crazy. You're not dramatic. You're not attention-seeking. Your body is trying to tell you something important. Listen to it. Trust it. Advocate for it. Find people who believe you when you say something is wrong. Surround yourself with medical providers who take your concerns seriously. Build relationships with people who respect your experiences, even when they don't understand them. And remember that you don't owe anyone your suffering in silence. You don't have to minimize your pain to make other people comfortable. You don't have to doubt yourself to preserve family harmony. Trust your body, trust your instincts, trust yourself. Because in the end, you're the only one who knows what it feels like to live in your skin. And that knowledge is valid, important, and worthy of respect. Thank you for listening to my story. Please share it if it resonated with you, and let me know in the comments if you've had similar experiences. Together, we can change the culture that teaches people not to trust themselves. Together, we can save lives. Trust your body. It might just save your life. If you or someone you know is experiencing medical symptoms that are being dismissed, please seek a second opinion. Remember, you know your body better than anyone else.